With the Devil May Cry series, Capcom successfully established and refined an entire genre of video games through excellent gameplay mechanics that were as flashy and indulgent as they were immersive and engrossing. By constructing gameplay systems with the breadth, nuance, and dynamism to match even the most proficient player's skill, Devil May Cry became a name synonymous with stylish and substantive action. After resuscitating the ailing franchise from the brink of obscurity with Devil May Cry 3, Capcom decided that the fourth installment in the series would take full advantage of the then cutting-edge technology found in the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. This would allow for greater graphical fidelity, new gameplay mechanics, and a wider assortment of enemies, environments, and bosses for players to test their skills against. However, in order to appeal to a wider audience for the next generation of consoles, the developers decided to make DMC4 an origin story of sorts, following the adventures of Nero, a mysterious teenager possessing a demonic arm and an obvious connection to Sparta and his twin sons. The most overt flaw with this premise is that Nero, as well as the story at large, lack any sort of context in DMC's lexicon. Nero's origins remain nebulous at best by the time the story is concluded, and the overall impact of the narrative on the series in its entirety is negligible. Nero is definitely a likable character on his own. However, in creating another sarcastic, wisecracking, over-the-top demon killer, the developers only succeeded in diluting the charm and originality of the series' protagonist Dante. The very existence of Nero in the world of DMC is deleterious to Dante's character, as it makes him that much less unique in his own universe and feels like a cheap ploy to cater to a younger demographic. Even so, Dante absolutely steals every scene that he's featured in, and is an absolute delight to watch on screen as he taunts bosses and delivers one-liners with the cheesy yet dry wit that longtime fans of the series have come to expect from him. By the time players have progressed far enough to control the Son of Sparta, his attitude is a welcome change of pace from Nero's, as his scenes are mostly angst-fueled melodrama that lack any real urgency. Nero as a character is little more than a Dante facsimile, successfully exhibiting Dante's qualities while struggling to transcend the sum of his parts. He's lacking in the soul that Dante illustrates and is hindered substantially by his role as a Dante derivative. The way that Nero handles in-game mirrors his position thematically, as he shares many of Dante's attributes and handles relatively similarly. However, there exists a wealth of mechanical potential that Nero has at his disposal, and overall Nero is a fun character to play as, even if his mechanics are shallow by comparison to Dante's. Most of his gameplay revolves around the Devilbringer. Since Nero's arm seems to be in a state of flux, he has acquired the ability to create a spectral arm with which to grab, pull, slam, and hold enemies. The Devilbringer is Nero's most instrumental ability, as it plays a large role in combat as well as puzzle solving and platforming sequences, and is also used for cinematic finishers on adversaries. In addition to the Devilbringer, Nero has access to the Red Queen, a unique sword that can be revved to augment attacks, and the Blue Rose, a revolver that is mostly useful for defying gravity and charged attacks. It's safe to say that the unique Red Queen introduces Nero's most novel gameplay mechanics, the Exceed and Max Axe systems respectively. Since the Red Queen is a sword that can be revved, Nero can magnify his damage output substantially by filling 1, 2, or 3 of the sword's energy slots. The number of slots filled will enact various properties upon his attacks, making for more options to experiment with and more satisfying combat scenarios. For example, if Nero attacks with Streak, his Stinger equivalent, while none of the charge slots have been filled, he will just hurl himself forward and attack an enemy doing very little damage. However, if he has one slot filled, he will hurl himself toward an enemy doing a 360 spin, dealing greater damage. 2 slots will produce a 720 spin, and naturally 3 slots a 1080 spin with a significant increase in damage output. Using the Exceed system in conjunction with Max Act, an ability that allows players to fully charge the Red Queen's attack gauge with a single perfectly timed button input, can produce some devastating results and is always satisfying to pull off. While the Red Queen is definitely a nuanced weapon in and of itself, it's safe to say that it isn't nuanced enough to sustain your palate for the entirety of Nero's campaign. The game does a good job with throwing various obstacles your way to quell the monotony, but before Nero's campaign is concluded, most players will probably be wary of his limited moveset, repetitious enemy encounters, and boring platforming sequences. Nero does eventually acquire a second melee weapon, the Yamato, about halfway into his campaign. However, it works only when Nero has Devil Triggered and only consists of 3 unique abilities, 2 of which being charge attacks. While Nero is a great character for beginners to experiment with, his overall ease of use and lack of variety is an overt oversight on the developer's part, and will more likely than not succeed only in alienating new players to Dante's rich and varied gameplay. Since Nero can grapple, pull, and lunge toward enemies with ease, using Dante may be akin to learning a foreign language to those who have become accustomed to Nero's comparatively shallow mechanics. The game does a terrible job of easing new players into Dante's playstyle, and practically assumes that they've experienced prior games in the series before dropping him into their laps. Nonetheless, in spite of the discordant pacing, players who have the patience, time, and skill to delve into Dante's mechanics will be rewarded with some of the greatest gameplay that the hack-and-slash genre has ever produced. Dante essentially breaks the game as he can obliterate anything in his path with relative ease. However, in order to get the most out of Dante's mechanics, players must become accustomed to switching styles, guns, and melee weapons on the fly to produce some of the most advanced and impressive combinations to have ever graced an HD game console. The overwhelming number of techniques that Dante has at his disposal at all times can be intimidating at first, especially with the introduction of on-the-fly style switching. Style switching itself creates almost limitless gameplay depth, as it allows Dante to switch paradigms with the push of a button. For example, using the Swordmaster style will give Dante access to attacks that focus solely on his melee weapons. However, if players are interested in more fluid maneuverability, switching over to the Trickster style will be a sound option, as it allows Dante to teleport, run on walls, and dash in the air. Whenever one style has been selected, the moveset for the other 4 styles will be inaccessible, so learning to switch between these playstyles on the fly will produce the most impressive, intricate, and rewarding results. In addition to styles, Dante has access to 3 melee and projectile weapons, which can all be switched on the fly and seamlessly comboed into one another both in the air and on the ground, producing an overwhelming number of combinations for players to experiment with. It's safe to say that in spite of Nero's newfound place as the primary protagonist of DMC4, Dante is the sole reason for the success of this title both thematically and mechanically. However, this isn't to say that the Dante side of the game isn't lacking in some respects. While Dante definitely has access to a wide variety of attacks and abilities, overall his moveset feels lacking, especially in comparison to the previous iteration of the series, which gave him 5 melee and projectile weapons and 6 styles to choose from, 7 if you include Darkslayer style. Certain styles such as Royal Guard and Gunslinger seem a little less powerful than they were in DMC3, and Dante's Darkslayer variant feels like it was tacked on, barely featuring any attacks or abilities to choose from. Dante's Devil Trigger burst is also nowhere to be found and seems to have been replaced with his ability to warp reality with distortion. Distortion allows Dante to intensify his attacks with well-timed activation and deactivation of his Devil Trigger, very reminiscent to Nero's Exceed and Max Act mechanic, only to a greater extent. Dante's ability to distort attacks can produce the most powerful onslaughts in the game, shaving off giant chunks of enemy and boss life bars, even on the highest difficulties. While distortion is definitely a welcome addition to Dante's repertoire, there's absolutely no reason that the DT burst shouldn't have been implemented in some way to give players even more options to test. Of course, the lack of brand new styles or even returning weapons from prior installments detracts from the overall experience and can definitely make the game feel as though it were lackadaisically pieced together with very little forethought. There is a wealth of potential here that has been misused, likely due to time constraints, which hinders the overall experience. Even so, DMC4 is far more nuanced mechanically than 99% of other games on the market today, and succeeds to varying degrees at fusing the best elements from the first 3 titles in the franchise into a cohesive whole that is both fun to play and look at. One thing that DMC4 improves on over its predecessor is in its enemy design, both functionally and aesthetically. The enemies in DMC4 have access to a wide range of attacks and abilities, and are all distinct in look and modus operandi, making each enemy feel very unique and interesting. However, very much like Nero, the enemies are derivative, as many of them are redesigns of enemies from DMC1, and even share the same exact traits and attack patterns with very little deviation from their initial incarnations. The bosses of DMC4 are definitely the game's highlight, as each boss is unique and on a more grandiose scale than anything found in prior installments of the series. Bosses such as Burial, Credo, Dante, and the Savior show flashes of brilliance that wouldn't have been possible during the PS2 era. In spite of the exhilaration that bosses elicit initially, the sense of elation achieved by their masterful encounters is quickly abolished when you are forced to do battle against these bosses constantly over the course of the campaign. While the DMC series has always recycled bosses, it's never felt as overt and deleterious to the gameplay experience as it has in this installment, since in prior games, bosses were outfitted with new abilities during subsequent encounters, or weren't mandatory in order to complete the game. The monotony that's overwhelmingly present in the boss encounters extends to the game's beautiful environments, which will become all too familiar before you've completed the game in its entirety. Since the developers forced Dante to backtrack through Nero's campaign with very little deviation in level structure and design, the artificial means that were used to lengthen the game's obviously short campaign length become one of its most critical drawbacks, making overall completion an effort in tedium. Even so, DMC4 features a campaign that is infinitely replayable and addictive, and is definitely rewarding to play through multiple times. Devil May Cry 4 is also by far the easiest game in the original DMC series due to a variety of quizzical design choices. The tweaked style meter is perhaps the most obvious of these changes, since the meter no longer falls at a constant rate and is instead relatively congenial to players, refusing to drop a rating unless the player has been damaged somehow. This attenuates the intensity and strategy that satiated the combat scenarios in prior entries in the series, making the game feel passive and lethargic by comparison. Devil May Cry 3 was especially taxing on the player's faculties, as it forced gamers to remain cognizant of all enemies and their respective distances from Dante at any given moment, so as not to allow the meter to drop too far, which would have had dire effects on the player's overall mission ranking and gameplay style. If you weren't able to keep the style meter at its apex in prior entries in the series, you were rated accordingly, forcing you to rethink your strategies on the fly, making for a more rewarding, fast, and exhilarating experience. The style meter present in DMC4 does very little to reflect your combat mastery, as you can essentially stroll around the battlefield at your leisure with little to no incentive to continuously bombard enemies, since the meter will remain relatively close to its apex once you've reached an S ranking. The higher difficulties on display here are a lot easier than anything that veterans of the series are used to, due in large part to laughable damage output by enemies and bosses. Most enemies aren't much of a threat and can be dispatched of with very little complication, and bosses are far too predictable to deliver a sufficient challenge on must-die mode, especially after having faced them countless times over the course of your campaign playthroughs. DMC4's most damning flaw, however, is how rushed and by extension incomplete it ends up feeling overall. The overuse of boss battles, environments, enemy encounters, Dante's very brief playtime, the lack of alternate costumes and satisfying unlocks for characters, Nero's lack of weapon variety, and the nebulous story assiduously communicate that DMC4 is an unfinished game. It seems as though the designers intended to include a wide variety of features but were encumbered by deadlines and pressure from upper management, and as a result, most ideas seem to have been scrapped in favor of a less engrossing product that sadly feels more like a step to the side than an evolutionary step forward for the franchise. I can't help but feel that if given a few more months of incubation, we would have been presented with a game that was at least on par with Devil May Cry 3. As it stands currently, Devil May Cry 4 is overall a stellar hack-and-slash title that fails to reach its full potential due to lackadaisical design decisions and an unnecessary tonal shift from exhilarating and nuanced combat to accessibility and appeal. Most of the game's most pernicious flaws revolve around the introduction of the new primary protagonist, Nero, and would have been tempered if not expunged completely if Nero and his weapons and abilities were somehow implemented within Dante's already varied and nuanced combat mechanics, pushing the series even further from a mechanical perspective. While Devil May Cry 4 presents players with dynamic, layered, and deep mechanics, this is only true for about 1/3 of the title's overall runtime, as the rest of the game consists of Nero's functional, yet repetitious and derivative gameplay with moments of brilliance strewn throughout. It is because of this that I will be awarding Devil May Cry 4 an 8 out of 10. Even with its uneven pacing, questionable design philosophy, and thorough lack of context, DMC4 can easily produce some of the most dynamic, nuanced, and impressive gameplay that the genre has ever seen, due in no small part to Dante and his substantive, yet stylish mechanics that tend to be as impressive and layered as they are overwhelming and confounding. Fans of the hack and slash genre should definitely pick up Devil May Cry 4, as it's easily one of the greatest hack and slash games on the market. However, it still fails to live up to the transcendent experience that Devil May Cry 3 provided. Devil May Cry 4 is a title that is brimming with untapped potential and could have easily been used as a schematic for future entries in the series. Capcom myopically chose to expand upon their missteps with Nero, producing one of the most divisive and pernicious reboots to a franchise in recent memory. As it stands currently, there is definitely hope for the future of the original Devil May Cry universe and its characters since the release of the commercial failure that was DMC Devil May Cry. The Devil May Cry series has had a tumultuous history, to put it lightly, as it's been mishandled by various developers and misunderstood by veterans and new gamers alike. Devil May Cry is not a commentary on the misdeeds of corporate America, it's not a deep and engrossing character study, it's not a flashy yet shallow roller coaster ride providing cheap thrills, it's not an indulgent pseudo-intellectual allegory for the perceptions that hinder sociological progress, it's not about the hair, and it's definitely not for everyone. Devil May Cry is trial, error, skill, hand-eye coordination, experimentation, quick reflexes, rewarding challenges, intense boss battles, nuanced mechanics, near limitless possibilities, imagination, and most of all fun, both thematically and contextually. Devil May Cry is a ludic system that gives us free rein to let our imaginations run wild with little to no bounds besides the ones that we've provided for ourselves. It challenges us to push our limits and breaks down the gamer-avatar dichotomy by giving us a system that we can control and influence as we see fit. It is poetry in motion, and upper-level play is reminiscent to masterfully crafting beautiful music, except instead of using a guitar as an instrument, we use a controller to create melody through muscle memory and reflex. To reiterate my sentiments at the end of my DMC HD collection review, the Devil May Cry series is deserving of far more respect and admiration than it currently receives, and is by far one of my favorite franchises in all of gaming. With that said, I hope that you all enjoyed my review of Devil May Cry 4. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to hear from you all in my next one.